Parashat Vayigash then is the dramatic culmination of the story of Yosef and his brothers. You may remember from last week that Yosef was originally visited by 10 of his brothers because there was a famine in the land of Canaan. They did not recognize him. He was a high power and second to the Pharaoh, high-powered official in Egypt. They did not recognize them. He provided them with food. He wanted to see his brother Benjamin. He sent them back to get Benjamin. They brought back Binyamin. And then he played a trick on them and had one of his assistants place his silver cup in Binyamin's bag. And when the brothers left, he had them pursued. He had them open all the bags. And the brothers said, whomever has, if anybody has a cup, we haven't stolen the cup, but if anybody has the cup, they will remain a slave to you. And the cup had been placed secretly in Binyamin's bag, and the cup was discovered. And now, Binyamin is at the risk of remaining in Egypt as a slave. And the brothers are in despair. How are they going to tell their father, back in Canaan, who has lost already a son, he believes, Yosef, whom he believes had been attacked by an animal and mortally wounded? How are they going to tell their father now that their second son, the youngest of all, the second son of Rachel, is going to stay as a slave in Mitzrayim? So they are desperate. And this is where the story begins this morning. And Yehuda, representing all the brothers, now stands before Yosef and implores him to allow him to take Binyamin's place. I'm going to stay in place of Binyamin. Let him go. And let him go back with the rest of the brothers to our father in the land of Canaan. It's a very powerful scene. And it's heart-wrenching. The appeal of Yehuda is heart-wrenching. Yehuda is able to access the impenetrable Yosef. And this moment becomes the turning point of the whole story. Midrash Tanchuma compares Yosef to a deep pit into which no one could climb down. And then a clever person came and brought a long rope that reached down to the water so he could draw from it. The Midrash says, so was Yosef deep, and Yehuda came to draw from him. Yosef had heard previously his brother's regret and remorse, and now he hears in this plea of Yehuda, he hears about his father's suffering. And Yosef now is ready to forgive, and he puts his brothers in a position to make a tikkun. I believe that in this parasha, particularly in this beginning of Yehuda, and later on in Yosef's words, there is a tremendous, both of them show a tremendous capacity for empathy. And that is the key that unlocks this narrative, empathy. And then when Yehuda finishes his plea before Yosef, Yosef now reveals himself, and that's at the bottom of page 275. His magnificent few verses. Bottom of page 275, the beginning of chapter 45. Yosef could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Yosef made himself known to his brothers. Imagine what he had been carrying for so long. Years and years, he's been carrying this. And then since he met his brothers several, maybe months earlier, what he's been carrying. And now his sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear. And so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Yosef said to his brothers, "I am Yosef. Ani Yosef." 2 words, that's how he revealed himself. Ani Yosef. Immediately he asked, "Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dumbfounded were they on account of him. Imagine. Then Yosef said to his brothers, "Come forward toward me." And then when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Yosef, he whom you sold into Egypt." He doesn't go into his suffering. He doesn't tell them, "You know how much pain I suffered? You know what it was to be in the pit? You know what it was to be sold as a slave? Can you imagine what I went through when I got to this place as a slave, serving in the house of Potiphar? And then I was thrown into prison. Do you know how I suffered?" He doesn't tell them a word about his victimhood, not a word. He does not go into the suffering. There's not one drop of victimhood, not a drop of revenge. He really allows empathy and brotherly love to prevail. He doesn't hide the painful truth. He says, "Look, I am your brother Yosef, he whom you sold into Egypt." He doesn't hide it. But he puts the brotherly bonds above his grudges. Not, "I am your brother Yosef, you sold me, you made me suffer, you destroyed my life, you separated me from my family." Just simple. Yes, you sold me, that's the truth. You sold me. You sold a brother. But I'm still your brother. I am your brother Yosef. I'm still your brother. And then most remarkable of all is how he understands, formulates and frames the painful facts of his life. Look at verse 5. "Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And God has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household and ruler over the whole land of Egypt." It's a complete reformulation of his life. This is the purpose of my life. I was sold here to save life. Never mind the suffering, the pain, what I went through. It was for something much greater. And you, my brothers, you were part of a plan that was not known to you, but it was a plan. It was God's plan that you would sell me so that I could save your life and the life of thousands and thousands of people. Aviva Zornberg writes, Joseph finds himself in relation to his brothers. His story is balanced on the axis, and you can review later, I, you, and you, me. That's the axis. I, you, and you, me. It's an honest but discriminating account of what they did and did not do to him, of the limits of their responsibility for disappearance. You sold me here, but it was not you who sent me here. The nexus between their realities is God, who has choreographed their relationships, their absences and losses in order to save life. God is the one who sent Yosef to Egypt. The word sent is used here 3 times to express God's purposeful perception. From the human perspective, Joseph was einenu. He was no longer in the narrative. He had ceased to be in the line of sight. But from God's perspective, he had been just where he was meant to be, swallowed up, giving and saving life. And she says, this is Joseph's therapeutic narrative, full of expressions of relationship, unblinking of the basic facts of the distance between you and me, but allowing God to take up the slack of that distance. Out of the brokenness has come a rethinking of the past, a redeeming of the past, a hope for wholeness in the house of Yaakov. Many commentators have pointed out that there is a progression in the resolution of conflict among brothers in the book of Bereshit. Think about the beginning. The first brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain murders Abel. And then come Ishmael and Isaac. They have completely separate lives. They meet in silence to bury Abraham. And they are basically the victims of the conflict of their parents, of Hagar and Sarah and Abraham in the middle. Silent victims. Their lives never meet except at the end just to bury their father. And then there's Yaakov and Esav. That's a very profound conflict that ends in a scene of encounter and tender scene of forgiveness, but then they each go their own way, never again to meet, except to bury their father. And then comes Yosef and his brothers. And here there is tremendous conflict, painful. But there is a resolution, there is empathy, there is forgiveness, and there is the reconstitution of family bonds. The family is back together. So you can see the progression, Cain and Abel, Tzach and Ishmael, Yaakov and Esav. And now here's the culmination. It's the triumph of forgiveness and the reconstitution of the family. After all the brotherly struggles, the book of Bereshit ends on a note of hope. And in the Haftarah, you will see later in the book of Yechezkel, the vision is magnificent. Thus says Adonai God, I am going to take the stick of Yosef, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and of the tribes of Israel associated with him, and I will place the stick of Judah and make them into one stick. Yosef and Judah into one stick. They shall be joined in my hand, says God. So that's the vision. Now compare Yosef's assessment of his own life as having served the purpose of God to save life with Yaakov's assessment of his own life. Look at page 285. 285, chapter 47, verse 7. Now Yaakov comes down to Mitzrayim. He meets Yosef, whom he thought had been dead. And it's a new beginning. Then Yosef then brought his father Yaakov and presented him to Pharaoh. And Yaakov greeted Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked Yaakov, "How many are the years of your life?" And Yaakov answered Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life, nor do they come up to the lifespans of my fathers during their sojourns." Then Yaakov bade Pharaoh farewell and left Pharaoh's presence. And Rashi says, he says here, the years of my sojourn on earth, in Hebrew, megurai, shnei megurai, megurai from the word ger, from the word resident, the years that I resided on the earth, but the word megurai is also from the word ger, which means stranger, exile. My life, all my life, I've been in exile. I've been a stranger. I've been in other people's lands, in Laban's land. Now I'm in Egypt. And I've been in exile of myself. And he says, and the years of my life have not reached the lifespan, they do not come up to the lifespans of my father's lives. And Rashi says, they don't come up in goodness. He feels terrible about his life. And this is what Rabbi Alter says in his commentary. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. Jacob's somber summary of his own life echoes with a kind of complex solemnity against all that we have seen him undergo. He has, after all, achieved everything he aspired to achieve. The birthright, the blessing, marriage with his beloved Rachel, progeny and wealth. But one measure of the profound moral realism of the story is that although he gets everything he wanted, it is not in the way he would have wanted. And the consequence is far more pain than contentment. From his clashing with his twin in the womb, everything has been a struggle. He displaces Esav, but only at the price of fear and lingering guilt and long exile. He gets Rachel, but only by having Leah imposed on him, with all the domestic strife that entails. And he loses Rachel early in childbirth. He is given a new name by his divine adversary, but comes away with a permanent wound. He gets the solar year number of 12 sons, but there is enmity among them, for which he bears some responsibility. And he spends 22 years continually grieving over his favorite son, whom he believes he's dead. This is in sum a story with a happy ending that withholds any simple feeling of happiness at the end. Tragic. But so is Yosef's story tragic, except that they're able to assess their lives in completely different ways. So the question is, when we connect the dots of the story of our lives, what do we see? How do we interpret the journey of our lives? With all their pain and complexity and challenges and struggle, do we see it like Yosef or we see it like Yaakov? In Yosef we find a sense of purpose, a sense that life has served a goal greater than himself, that he's been of service, that he's been sent. Through his suffering, Yosef opens up to empathy and forgiveness. He uses his suffering to open up to empathy and forgiveness. In Yaakov, we find a sense of bitterness and deep disappointment. But beyond our personal lives, we live at a time of great deficit of empathy and solidarity, and a great deficit of hope. We live at a time of really unbridled individualism, of me-firstism. In our country, a culture war is raging over race, gender identity, education, science, vaccines, abortion, guns, climate. Wherever we look, there is bitterness and disappointment. There's profound anger and there is hopelessness all across the map and all across the political map. There is profound anger and a sense of hopelessness. There is little or no empathy and solidarity. And there's a competition. Who's been more deprived? Who's more forgotten? Who's more oppressed? Who's more entitled? Who is more morally superior? Everyone and every group is involved in their own pain, in the wretchedness, the misfortune, the suffering of their own group, in the victimhood of their own group. Perhaps there is something we can learn from the story of Yosef and his brothers. Perhaps we can change the present narrative and forge, as Aviva Zornberg says, a therapeutic narrative, full of expressions of relationship, to paraphrase her. Out of the brokenness, maybe can emerge a rethinking of our past and our present, a redemptive reframing of the story, like Yosef did, that will bring the hope of empathy, of solidarity and wholeness. Shabbat Shalom.